All right, welcome back to the Waterfowl Management Podcast. We are on pillar number 3. So if you are just tuning into the podcast, make sure you go back and listen to 1 and 2 because they definitely impact what we're going to talk about today. So in this journey, the first one we've done was water control. You got to control your water in order to control the second pillar, which is food diversity. And so in the first 2 episodes, we covered both of those things, why they're important, why you should care. And in this one today, we're going to talk about kind of that next step. And this is going to be primarily for moist soil wetlands. So probably not as much of an ag component, although there certainly is one if you have a primarily ag wetland. But today we're going to discuss open water to cover ratio. And a lot of folks call it mowing. Simple way to talk about it and think about it. But the goal here is understand once we've got the ability to control water, once we've got the ability to have a diverse food source for the ducks, what do we do to make sure that they can use it prior to flooding in the fall? And so, Danny, since I saw you writing notes down earlier, why don't you kick it off and tell us, why would we mow in the fall at all?
Well, I'm going to move it up a little bit to late summer, early fall. One of the reasons that we wait a little bit longer to mow is that we want the seeds to mature on the moist soil plants so we can disperse those seeds. I mean, it's a multi-purpose event that we use mowing for. So we scatter the mature seeds on the ground. They're more accessible for feeding, for habitat, 4 to 10 inch water when you first start flooding. They create openings for birds to come into. It shows more water. And so these birds need those openings in this dense vegetation in order to get into your moist soil units. And so, Tony, those are really the 2 primary reasons that we're mowing. And we'll get into a little bit later about the different shapes, the different ways that we create these openings as far as, we might even touch on disking a little bit, but right now we're focused on mowing. And so those really are the 2 primary things that I can think about is you're mowing those openings to scatter the seed. You're also reducing vegetation. One I forgot. You're reducing that vegetation down to a level where in the fall, potentially you can get an invertebrate response, which is really going to be another layer of food. So you got seed, you got tubers, you got all these plant parts what the birds are looking for, and then you have this bloom of invertebrates. So it's just, this mecca of food that you're providing, and these openings then are shallower, they're more open, the birds can actually get into and use your marsh. So that's really some of the primary reasons why you would mow late summer, early fall.
Yeah, I'll add to that a little bit. I want to clarify real quick, too, to make sure, and Danny did mention it, but we're referencing mowing mostly in moist soil type habitats or wetland vegetation. Just keep in mind that if you're going to be mowing in any kind of planted crops, that's going to be a potential baiting issue. So you have to make sure where you're mowing and you're not getting into a baiting situation. So keep that in mind.
Even if it's planted millet.
That's right. If it's planted millet and the first year it's not volunteered yet, 1 year would still be considered a baited crop if you mow it. So yeah, be aware of that. Ever have any questions about it or think, thoughts on it, you can certainly ask us questions. We'll do our best to help you out. Your local conservation agent, any of those folks will be helpful as well. But kind of expand just a little bit. I think, if I think about mowing, and it does fall into more than just in the fall period, we do a lot of mowing for a lot of reasons otherwise. One of them being maintenance. We have a lot of maintenance activity, whether it's your ditches and sloughs that maybe carry the water to and from your units, so you might do some mowing for maintenance purposes on that, just keeping those places open, keeping woody debris out of stuff so you don't end up fighting that in your structures and pipes, that kind of thing. So there'd be maintenance type of mowing you might do in earlier parts of the year, the summer period. And then the other one is to invigorate certain plant responses or plant growth as well. I know Danny's talked about one several times over the past year. If you happen to have a good moist soil crop or millet coming on under, say, cucklebur or something like that, there's mowing for the purpose of enhancing that vegetation response to gain more food. And then the third one would be just kind of a lot of the other stuff Danny also just mentioned would be the mowing that you do for all the other reasons, that being creating that perfect match of open water to vegetative cover, putting food on the ground, the natural foods on the ground for the birds, setting the table for the invertebrate response, all those things. And so that would be kind of that later mowing that we get into right before we start putting water.
Building off of that, when we opened it up, we decided we were going to call it a ratio. And so talk about what a good, in your guys' opinion, I know this is subjective depending on where you are and what pool and all the different things, but how much of the wetland should we be mowing versus leaving standing and those kind of things?
I'll jump in that one. One of the things, there has been research done on the hemi marsh, and basically all that is a 50-50 open water and standing vegetation ratio. More species utilize that ratio. There's more species diversity that utilizes that than other percentages. What I like to do and what I've suggested to a lot of landowners is you need to experiment with this. 50-50 is great. If you want to start with that and evaluate it, monitor it, that's wonderful. But 30% may be a better ratio for you. I mean, depending on how much disturbance, your ingress and egress, maybe you need more percentage of standing vegetation to buffer your refuge or your birds than a 50-50 ratio. So it's really kind of an on the ground subjective evaluation of what you think you need to have good hunting and also take care of the birds. Because I experienced the 30% ratio. I told the guy that I was working with, I said, that's not enough. I mean, 30% open is not enough. It's not going to work out, but it did. I mean, the birds used it. They were buffered. It was beautiful. And they got into that standing vegetation later as it broke down and the birds could get into it and feed in it. So it's kind of an experiment. And I mean, that's my main point on the ratio. And we'll talk about shapes and serpentine shapes and kidney shapes a little bit later. But it's kind of like, if you want to be conservative and start 30% open, 70% standing, go ahead. If you think it needs to be more, then the next year, maybe you open it up a little bit more, depending on what you see as far as bird response.
Yeah, and I think there's some other things that you can help or use to help guide that decision, I think. And one of them is, what is it that you're actually mowing? There's a big difference between mowing and millet versus smartweed. Some years, I'm sure you've all seen it, where you have a great crop of smartweed that came on early and grew like crazy and gets up to be head high or higher. I would probably say you probably ought to err towards a higher percentage of mowed opening in that, because that stuff gets so robust and thick that without that extra mowing, those birds just don't get into the middle of that habitat until especially late in the year. Maybe by springtime they might be using it really well, but you may take the better part of the fall season before they would ever get into it. Whereas if it's millet, the grassy component, not just millets, your panicums and all your other grasses, they tend to fall down a lot sooner. They also shed their seed or scatter seed a lot quicker naturally than maybe some of the smartweed does as well. And so, probably if you had a lot of grass, yeah, the 30% is probably going to be a little bit better option maybe than the 50%. But if you're in heavy smartweed, I would err towards the 50% instead of 30%. And that changes. I mean, every year is a little different in how robust your vegetation is and all of that.
And the plant species Michael mentioned earlier about cocklebur. I mean, if you have a large expanse of cocklebur because of your drawdown or just because of the way things happened, and you've got a bunch of millet in the understory, you may want to mow 80% of it, to encourage that food resource to really come up and produce seed. And we did an experiment. I'm not saying it's the best technique. We did an experiment recently with some large spike rush. We mowed it off because we wanted to disrupt the plant growth. We saw that we had grasses in the understory only a few inches tall. And so, I don't know, it's been a couple of weeks ago, but some of that grass has actually emerged and it's starting to come up through that large spike rush, whereas before it appeared to be so suppressed it would never make it. So, and we did a large, quite a percent. We probably did close to 50% of the unit just mowing that stuff off. So sometimes you gotta go with what the vegetative type is and make openings and do mowings accordingly if it's going to release something else that you want to release.
One of the things that I've learned in my journey of mowing, which is 100% my favorite part of the whole process, is getting to mow in the fall and lay out what the wetland is going to look like. I would rather do that than pretty much anything else. But I vividly remember after the flood of 2019, mowing smartweed that was taller or as tall as the tractor cab, because there was no maintenance that could get done on it, and that it was just that much. And so that year we 100% absolutely did not mow enough at all. And we did not have the bird use that we should have had because of that, because the birds simply cannot find it. I've heard people say over the years, not many people, but I've heard people say over the years that, put water in it and it'll fall down and they'll find it. And that just simply is not the case in every situation and every, vegetation type. But I think that it's important that you think about this from not like if you have a 100-acre pool, doesn't mean you have to mow 50 acres, to feel good about that. You might end up mowing 30, but in some areas you mowed a bunch of it. If you look at that as a smaller square, like if you have split it up into 25-acre chunks, you might mow more in a certain square and less in another. And so it just really is an experiment, like Danny talked about, to kind of figure out what you like and what you don't like and what the birds like and what they don't like.
And make sure we look at this too. Use that mowing as an opportunity to treat problem areas. Danny just mentioned that was an initial attack on some spike rush. But, maybe you have an area where you have a bunch of perennial plants coming in that otherwise that, you want to try to address the problems there and you want to stress them a little bit or just knock them back so you can come back with another treatment. Maybe it's perennial smartweed or something you want to address. But any of that mowing, disturbing, disking, whatever you want to get into on some of that, you sacrifice a little bit this year for a better product next year as well. So, make sure when you lay out your mowing pattern plan for the whole year and the fall in particular, that you kind of mow with a plan, if you would, I guess. Try to target those areas that need to be disturbed. Maybe next year you can mow them this year. That'll help you get into them next spring when you're ready. Maybe if you got some woody stuff in some ditches where you're trying to maintain your drainage, knock those out as part of your mowing plan this year. Maybe you got some really robust smartweed in one unit. Try to make sure you hit that where you open it up in a nice pattern so that makes a good habitat, usable habitat for birds throughout the season. If you got super heavy grass, a lot of times, one of the things that you'll see is that stuff starts lodging because if it gets really good growing conditions, good fertile situation, can get really tall, that stuff will start falling over and lodging. So, maybe you're already getting some of that opening in there before you ever even start mowing, so keep all those different things in mind and kind of develop that plan before you start that mowing itself and know where you want to go and how much you want to mow and lay it out that way.
That's a really great thought because that's what we did on that large spike rush. We only hit the areas that were dense. Those that were more open and already had grass in them that were coming on, we didn't mow. So it was kind of a spot mowing event, and we definitely improved. Like I said, fair results, won't say good, but fair results on encouraging those plants that we wanted by mowing. But we're going to have to reset at some point for sure. We just got tight on time and some other factors, but that's a great point. We really only treated the areas we thought we really needed to prioritize.
Why don't we dive into shapes a little bit? And you both probably have very specific opinions, but Dad, I know you have a very, very specific opinion about shapes. And so why don't you try to verbally illustrate, what your vision of a perfectly mowed wetland might look like?
I'm not sure my view is a whole lot different than Danny's necessarily. We can critique the same spot and have the same mowing shape, and next time we would mow them completely different. So, yeah, we'll look at it a lot in the same way, I guess. But one of the biggest things I think we get from mowing is, despite the things, or not despite, but outside of the things that we just talked about with all the other reasons you would mow, but it's that edge effect you get. You want to create that edge. The more edge you provide out there, I think the better use you'll get. The birds will find spots like Danny will mention, I'm sure. You get those little kidney-shaped spots that are hidden from everything else. They feel secure in there. You just get better bird use in general. You can, especially if you're tying it in with refuge habitat, stuff like that, making sure that refuge is undisturbed, from any kind of ingress or egress activity or hunting activity that might be going on. And so just be creative with it. And I like to create more natural looking openings that might mimic like an old stream channel or something that would run through the landscape. So if you think about all your standing vegetation out there, and you're a duck coming in the fall, the water he sees, there might be water through a lot of the unit, but the water he sees initially looks like a natural slough or a natural shape on the landscape. And I just think it's aesthetically pleasing, I think, for me personally, and hopefully for the birds as well, I guess. But, there's a lot of discussion too on how big those openings have to be and how wide they have to be. It all depends, I think, on each individual situation. But if you're looking at it as a spot to hunt, You need to make sure it's big enough that you give those birds room to kind of get in there and work and not have to be over a lot of cover, a lot of vegetation when they're working. You got to give them a little bit of room. So a lot of different things go into that plan, but just be creative. Don't draw out big long lines, and also don't leave big blocks of habitat unmowed if you can help that. There are situations, maybe if it's idle crop from last year where still has some food left in it, corn left in it or what have you from last year, you wouldn't be able to necessarily go in and mow those blocks. So you have to keep that in mind. But yeah, be creative and make sure it looks like there's 30+% open. And the other thing too, crossover elevational grades. I think it's important when you're doing your mowing that you don't just mow the low spots. It's important to mow low spots, but you also want to mow some of those same location or same shapes out on the higher sites as well. That way, as water comes up, if you're doing dynamic water management through the season, every time you bring that water up a little bit, you bring in a whole new host of food and or locations for those birds to adapt to.
Yeah, I think you nailed it all, Michael. In one swoop, I think you nailed it all. So I would line up with that exactly perfectly. Just make sure, I think that width is really important, especially if you're trying to work birds into it from the hunting standpoint. And but for all the reasons that Michael has just mentioned, that's why you should have serpentine shapes, you should have kidney shapes, no straight lines, and the birds are going to respond to it a lot better.
I'm going to share a story.
I knew there would be a spot for Kale to jump in here on this because he will want a straight line somewhere.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna share this story, even though maybe I shouldn't. And if you don't want me to, I guess we can cut it. But in college, I befriended one of my professors because he accidentally mentioned in class that he duck hunted a little bit, and so I thought I would use my, the fact that I like to duck hunt too to get a better grade in his class. And so I went to his office hours, and I'd emailed him before and told him that you managed Ted Shanks and you figured out who this is already by now. And I walked around the corner of his office, and he had Google Earth or Google Maps or whatever it was pulled up on his computer, and he said, and I recognized it right away. It was the Ted Shanks refuge pools, and Google Maps had updated in the middle of them being mowed, and so everybody could kind of see what they might look like just because, it doesn't update that much, but it had updated at that time. And he's like, what's going on here? And it was like it was literally one or two straight lines and then a serpentine all the way through them, looked like a DNA helix thing. And he's like, what's the logic behind this? And I was like, I don't remember if I already knew the answer to that or not, but I was like, I don't think Dad really liked that one. That really wasn't his vision for what that pool was supposed to look like. So I don't know if you want to add any color to that one or not.
Yeah, I will. I can't help it. Sometimes, when you work with other people and staff, not that they intend to go out and do something different than what you would want, but sometimes we don't necessarily give them the best direction. So I think my direction to them was just go out there and be creative in what you mow. And that's what we got. And, I'm not sure I even saw that particular spot until we had aerial pictures of it start showing up. So yes, does it mean the ducks didn't use it? Probably not. They probably still used it. It had, good percentage open and certainly was creative. Wasn't anywhere near what you would think as a natural looking or appeasing appearance when you looked at it. But certainly the birds, I'm sure they probably didn't care. They just wanted to get open water and get into the habitat and use it and find some secure habitat to hang out in. But yeah, so if you have people that you work with and that help you and that enjoy helping and doing some of this work, you might give them more direction than just saying be creative. Just kind of give them an example or an idea or two of what creative means in your mind.
Absolutely. So I guess talk a little bit about what it looks like when it's done wrong. Like if you would look at a place and you'd walk in and we did a course on this already, but like when you walk up to a wetland and you're like, oh crap, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think for me, the big thing, and it took me a little time, to figure this out as well, I think. But I think if you don't mow enough, that is a big, big problem. Multiple reasons. I mean, the bird use might be okay over time. It's not going to be as good as it could be initially, for sure. But I think when you do that, if you don't mow enough, you're not going to get the bird use. Just like you mentioned in the flood year we dealt with, the birds just don't get into that habitat and use it. And so I think that's one of the mistakes that you're going to make with mowing is not mowing enough. Keep in mind too, I think there's a lot of, I don't know about misunderstanding or misinformation, but I don't think most people realize that with moist soil plants, the majority of them drop their seed way before duck season starts. The big percentage of their seed, once that plant produces the mature seed and starts, the plant itself starts to senesce, that seed starts dropping. And so that seed's going to be on the ground. And so by leaving that plant standing, you're not necessarily leaving seed above the water surface, if you will. And so, I mean, some of it will, certainly not all of it falls or drops. A millet is going to be a lot more so than smartweed. Smartweed's going to hold on to some of that seed a little longer. But when you're mowing, keep in mind that seed's already going to fall off that plant. Don't just assume that if you leave that standing taller that those birds will be able to reach in there and get that food later, because it's already going to have fallen out on the majority of that, by November anyway, probably mid-November, somewhere in there. But yeah, for me, I guess the big mistake you can make is simply not mowing or mowing enough. If you don't mow at all, you're going to really miss out.
I think one of the things, and we could probably talk about this as a separate topic, and that's disking. I think when I'm walking into a marsh, if you've mowed your openings, that's great. But if you have the wrong types of vegetation in there, whether it be woody or herbaceous, and you haven't put a disc on it, I think that's a huge mistake, because you really fall behind when you don't use the right technique. A disking is a very, very good technique to reset. And when it's time to reset, you really shouldn't hesitate. It's time to do something. You're going to benefit. You may benefit waterfowl in the fall by taking that vegetative matter, putting it in the ground, and invertebrates could respond to it that fall. So you could get an invertebrate response there. You're creating a mud flat that eventually, when you draw down the next spring, birds are going to use it. Multiple species, including shorebirds, are going to use it. They may use it in the fall too, depending on when your flooding goals are. But I think that to me is what sometimes I'll see mowings that it's like, why didn't you disc this? This would have been a much better technique to use rather than mowing. And so that's something that I see or observe and look for, when I'm helping people out.
I think that's a good point to remember too, because we stress a lot just in our moist soil management that disturbance is hugely important to maintain that highly productive state that you want to be in. 1 to 3 years, maybe depending on the site, you might get more than that. But, we see a lot even between 1 and 2 years. I know on some of the stuff we're working on, you go past 2 years and it starts fading out pretty heavily. And so, that disturbance, and when we say disturbance, disking is the one we use most of the time, but that's a huge part of it too. And so, if you can incorporate that into your openings that you're creating for the fall, then you're gaining double benefit there. You're making your openings, you're creating that invertebrate opportunity, and you're setting succession back for next year. So should have a much better seed crop come into that next year. So very good point.
So we came a long way there. Any other ways that you would walk up to a wetland and think, man, this is, I really wish you'd have done something else?
I think, again, if you're looking at it, let's look at it from a hunting standpoint. That's another one that I know you have a lot of thoughts on, Cale, and how you're going to hunt a spot. If you don't, maybe you mowed 50%, but 50%, say you take a 100-acre block and you cut it down the middle and mowed one side. Well, you've mowed 50%, but boy, you really haven't met the goal of what you need yet. I mean, you need to break that down into smaller, maybe a 10-acre block where you mow 3, 4, 5 acres in that, or 6 acres in the next 10, whatever it is. But you have to look at the whole wetland as one big piece, and you need basically equal representation across that whole unit of mowing and or disking and openings. And then within that, if you have spots that you're hunting, that's where I would look at my mowing a little bit more for the purpose of retrieving. You have some good examples where you use straight line mowing for casting your dog on longer retrieves to get them out where you can get birds picked up quick and efficiently. Also, in public land management, I learned over time that whenever we had these bigger blocks of vegetation without openings in them, we really lost a lot of cripples, and it wasn't that folks weren't trying to find birds that they sailed out. Birds get into those big blocks of heavy vegetation, you just can't find them. And so, opening it up, with a variety of different openings, but make sure you have some spots, if it's a place where you're going to be hunting, that you can kind of corral those birds, leave them some little blocks of cover standing, but it's open all around them where they'll go in there and hole up and they won't come out. Then you got a better chance of finding them.
Yeah, I guess just the knowledge and information to know that what undesirables are, and targeting those in a big way. And if mowing is the only technique you have, at least you have a marker. You can mark that stuff in the late summer, early fall. You know it'll stay suppressed for a while, in the spring, so you can identify it and attack it even more with a disc the next year. But it's not going to hurt to go ahead and set that stuff back. Sesbania is another one that doesn't like mowing, so you can set it back by mowing it. Cocklebur is another one. Don't really recommend blunt spike rush unless you just run out of time, or not blunt spike rush, but large spike rush. When you run out of time, cattails are another one, bulrush, all these plant species in the wrong percentages, like higher percentages across your marsh landscape is not going to meet your objective. So mark it, identify it, mow it. If that's what you have, get ready for next year. If you have a disc, that's even better. But if all you have to do is to mark it with mowing, don't leave it untouched. Just try to disturb it if you can that year.
I know you've got some thoughts too, Danny, kind of backtracking just a little bit here, but on some of the shapes that we create and mow, why don't you expand a little bit more on what you think about like the different shapes and what we gain from that? I know you've got some good ideas on how birds use those different shapes sometimes.
Yeah, I have kind of a specific way to open up a blind, and this is strictly, for hunting purposes, but it's, you're going off each of the blind about a 45-degree angle, and then you're coming around, you're arcing that from point to point, 40 yards out from the front of the blind. You can put 30 dozen decoys in it. That's strictly from a hunting standpoint. These, and it's worked for me. It's worked for me and friends of mine that I've hunted with. And so those are things you observe and experience over time. And, so the openings need to be large enough, where birds, like Michael was saying before, they've got to be able to work into them. It's got to be open where they can work over some lower vegetation and then come into these openings and, where it's not real tight. And I think, this is repetitive, but that edge effect is so important to think about because birds are getting around the corner, that, the escape cover is better. They can escape from predators rather than having a straight line. Something can chase them down that straight line and see them the whole time, and they know where they're ducking in. But when the bird is around a corner, they lose sight of them. And ducks are tricky. They're going to get out of sight and get away from predators pretty quick. So just having those serpentine shapes, kidney shapes, that edge effect is extremely important. And so that's really the bottom line there. And they also like, repetitive again here, but still good points to repeat. It adds that buffer. Those birds can be buffered from disturbance by those irregular shapes. They can get around the corner. They can slide around these corners and get away from disturbance. And so you're likely to have the birds there longer. They're going to be more secure, especially if you have refuge areas with these kind of shapes. So good for hunting, good for refuge, good for the birds. It's a win-win.
For me, this kind of
another one too.
Go ahead, Dad.
I would say another one that kind of comes into play there, we haven't really talked about yet is the impact those serpentine type mowing, those little secret spots have for birds, say mid-November on. You're starting to get a lot of those mallards that are getting into that pair bonding activity and some of that early behavior. And so any of that kind of stuff where they can get out of sight around a little corner in a little nook away from other birds even gives them a better chance of developing that pair bond. And, we know the sooner they get a good solid bond built and start protecting that, probably the more productive they're going to be throughout the rest of the year. They're locked in on who their mate is, and they're gonna focus on getting through winter and getting back to the nesting grounds quick and taking care of business. So yeah, I think there's some good pair bonding activity to be kept or to keep in mind with that mowing pattern as well.
For me, I think this comes back a lot to how you like to hunt your property too. If you're hunting from a permanent blind of some kind, or if you're hunting more of a freelance style, we have very much adapted to hunting where the ducks want to be and not necessarily trying to force them to go to a blind that we want to hunt. So, we love the Invisimans. The Invisimans have been a great addition to our arsenal as far as being able to hide and have really good effective hunts other places. But what that changed in the way that I mow when I'm sitting in the tractor, I'm sitting there looking at it and I'm like, oh, that vegetation right there, we can hide in, in this type of scenario really easily. So, okay, now I'm going to make an extra couple passes to make sure that if we did choose to hunt right there, that we've got enough water out here for the decoys. This hole looks good enough that a duck's going to come into it and then, go on about my way. But I'm always thinking about that. How can we hide? What can we hide in? Those kind of things as we're going, as opposed to you might do it differently versus a blind where you can look at it and say, I'm going to mow it like this and the ducks have to come in this way and this is how it's going to be. And so it's just all experimentation for me, I think. So perfect. Well, kind of one of the things that I wanted to ask earlier, we didn't get to it, is we talked a lot about smartweed and millet, mainly because those are the two primary plants that everybody wants to talk about when it comes to moist soil. It's definitely not the only ones, but it is the primary two. And so most people can also identify those. What does the seed need to look like on both of those plants before I know that I'm ready to mow?
That's fairly easy, actually. I think if you take millet as a good example, when you're walking out in your marsh and you see that millet head, just kind of grab it, run your hand up it, and a lot of times you'll get a good solid handful of duff, kind of rub it between the palms of your hand, and you'll start seeing some of the hard seed in there. Once you get that hard seed starting to show up, that's pretty much matured at that point. It may still be a little green, but it'll dry on down. And then smartweed, same thing. Just grab a head off of it and strip it and kind of rub it around in your hand, and you'll see those little seeds pop out. And the more black they get, the more mature they are. They'll start out, they'll be fairly green, but then they'll get, reddish black, almost kind of a real deep purple look to them. And when they get to that color, they're pretty much fully matured as well. And so, yeah, fairly easy to determine. And probably, mowing, if you're thinking, okay, am I going to go mow yet, or do I need to wait for my seed heads to mature a little farther? I would say you probably want that millet where the majority of that head is already kind of yellow. If you get some of the green seed off the bottom part of the head, that's probably okay. But wait until that seed it'll mature. Mostly millet will mature more on the top of the head first, and it works its way down to the bottom of the head. Some of that stuff at the bottom will be the green still. So make sure it's getting most of it matured before you mow it. Kind of same with the smartweed. Once you start getting a lot of that seed where you're getting the majority of it, when you kind of strip it off in your hand, is kind of getting that dark color, that purplish black look to it, then you're probably already good enough as well. But, it's pretty obvious too. Maybe I shouldn't say obvious, but it's important to remember that when you do decide to mow, on your moist soil, the best seed heads and the best seed production is going to come off of the primary growth of that plant. Once that plant's been mowed, you might, if you mow it earlier in the season, you might get some more seed heads come back on, but you're going to probably have a lot less production than you would if you let that first seed crop go all the way through before you mow it off.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I'd do the same thing Michael's talking about. Just
most of the millet too, unless you're doing a late drawdown where you got really late millet coming on, most of that stuff, by the time you start looking at doing your fall mowing kind of activities, it's going to pretty much already be matured. And
yeah,
you might still have some seed heads that are green and stuff that popped up late in the season that are coming on, but those are going to be the ones that are pretty limited. They're going to be shorter. They're going to be less seed producing probably than your original planting. So I wouldn't get too worried about mowing if I still have some seed heads left at the lower level, but get the majority of it done.
If you all out there like to teal hunt too, don't sweat this stuff. You're talking about if you got a teal hole, go ahead and mow it, whenever you want, and start flooding it if it's lower, whenever during August or early September, corresponded to teal migration, wherever you're at. Don't worry about the seed crop as much, because majority of the time, the teal hunting is probably going to be on a smaller scale. You're not going to hurt anything. You're not hurting your food resources because you're going to have a bigger picture outside of that hole. So don't be too apprehensive to manage for teal season if you want to.
Yeah, great point there. I feel like we nailed it. I don't know that I have a ton to add. I think we could probably do more deep dives on any one of these points if we wanted to later in the season. I do want to point out to anybody that's interested, I feel like we've created a phenomenal resource on mowing and what it should look like and all these different things with visuals on the Waterfowl Management Academy. So if you're interested in that, if you want help with how you should lay that out, go ahead and go out to our website and join that and watch those courses, because I think it is phenomenal. And this is the part that's why we felt this deserved a pillar, is because if you can have really great water control, water sources, you can have phenomenal food, but if you do not get this piece right, you're not going to see both of those things come to fruition as much as you possibly can. And so to get the best result out of the first two pillars, you've got to have this one. And so with that, guys, do you have anything else you want to say?
I think so.
All right. We'll catch
Keep up
everybody.
just keep up the good work to everybody.
Yeah, there you go. All right. We'll catch everybody on the next one.